Imagine being charged with possessing a machine gun, one of the most strictly controlled weapons in the United States. And then suddenly, a federal court ruling wipes those charges away. That's exactly what just happened in a controversial legal development that's now sending shockwaves through the U.S. legal system. A judge used a recent constitutional interpretation to strike down machine gun possession charges, and the U.S. Department of Justice is pushing back. A recent federal court ruling has drawn national attention after a judge dismissed criminal charges against a defendant accused of possessing a machine gun. The charges were brought under federal law, which strictly limits civilian access to these types of firearms. However, the judge determined that the prosecution could not move forward because the law used to charge the defendant did not meet the constitutional standards required by recent Supreme Court interpretations of the Second Amendment. As a result, the court decided to strike down the machine gun possession charges in this particular case. The decision was heavily influenced by the legal framework established in the landmark Supreme Court case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. In that 2022 ruling, the Supreme Court of the United States introduced a new method for evaluating firearm regulations. Instead of relying on traditional balancing tests that weigh public safety against gun rights, the court instructed lower courts to determine whether a modern gun law is consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States, particularly during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Applying this historical test, the federal judge concluded that the government failed to demonstrate that broad bans on certain types of firearms, like machine guns, have clear historical precedents dating back to the country's founding era. Because prosecutors could not provide enough historical examples of similar restrictions, the court determined that the legal basis for the charge did not align with the constitutional framework outlined by the Supreme Court. It is important to note that the ruling does not automatically legalize machine guns across the country. Instead, it affects the specific case before the court and raises broader legal questions about whether existing federal firearm restrictions can survive the new constitutional standard. Nevertheless, the decision has sparked intense debate among legal experts, lawmakers, and gun policy advocates, many of whom believe the case could influence future challenges to long-standing firearm regulations. The legal dispute in this case centers on a long-standing federal restriction created under the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, particularly a provision commonly known as the Hughes Amendment. This law dramatically tightened regulations surrounding civilian ownership of machine guns in the United States. While machine guns had already been heavily regulated for decades, the 1986 amendment went a step further by effectively banning civilian possession of any machine gun manufactured after May 19, 1986. As a result, ordinary citizens cannot legally buy or possess newly produced machine guns, and only a small number of older, legally registered ones remain available for limited civilian ownership under strict federal oversight. Before this law was enacted, civilians could legally own machine guns if they complied with the requirements of the National Firearms Act of 1934. That earlier law required owners to register the weapon with the federal government, pass background checks, and pay a special tax. The 1986 law kept those requirements but froze the civilian market by preventing the registration of newly manufactured machine guns for private ownership. Today, only machine guns that were legally registered before the cutoff date can be transferred to civilians, and even those transfers involve an extensive federal approval process. Because of these restrictions, machine guns are among the most tightly controlled firearms in the United States. Possessing an unregistered machine gun, or one produced after the 1986 cutoff date, can lead to serious federal criminal charges, including long prison sentences and large fines. Federal prosecutors have relied on this law for decades to bring cases against individuals accused of illegal possession. In the recent court decision, the defendant was charged under this federal prohibition. However, the judge questioned whether the law itself meets modern constitutional standards following recent Supreme Court rulings on gun rights. This challenge does not automatically invalidate the law nationwide, but it raises important legal questions about whether such long-standing federal firearm restrictions can continue to withstand constitutional scrutiny in the future. A major reason this case has attracted so much attention is because it relies on a new legal framework established by the landmark Supreme Court decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. In that 2022 ruling, the The Supreme Court of the United States significantly changed the way courts across the country evaluate gun control laws under the Second Amendment. Before this decision, many courts used a balancing approach that considered both an individual's right to bear arms and the government's interest in protecting public safety. Judges would often weigh these two factors to determine whether a firearm regulation was reasonable. However, the Bruin ruling replaced that method with what is often called the historical tradition test. According to this standard, modern gun laws must be consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States, particularly during the time when the Second Amendment was adopted in the late 1700s and when the 14th Amendment was ratified in the 1800s. Instead of focusing on whether a law seems practical or necessary today, courts must now look to historical records to determine whether similar regulations existed during those earlier periods. This shift has had a major impact on legal challenges to gun laws across the country. Under the Bruin framework, when the government tries to defend a firearm restriction, it must show that comparable regulations existed historically. If prosecutors cannot point to historical examples that are sufficiently similar, the law may be considered unconstitutional under the new interpretation of the Second Amendment. In the machine gun possession case, the judge applied this historical analysis and asked whether the United States had a long-standing tradition of banning entire categories of firearms. Because the government struggled to present clear historical evidence of comparable bans from the founding era, the court concluded that the prosecution's argument did not satisfy the constitutional standard established by the Supreme Court's Bruin decision. In reaching the decision to dismiss the machine gun possession charges, the federal judge closely examined whether the government had met the constitutional standard required under modern Second Amendment rulings. Using the framework established by the Supreme Court in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the court focused on whether the federal restriction on machine guns could be justified by a historical tradition of similar firearm regulations in early American history. This meant the government had to provide convincing examples showing that comparable bans or restrictions existed during the nation's founding era. During the proceedings, prosecutors argued that machine guns are extremely dangerous weapons, capable of firing many rounds in rapid succession, which is why the federal government has long regulated them strictly. They pointed to the modern law created under the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986 that effectively prohibits civilians from possessing newly manufactured machine guns. According to the government, such restrictions are necessary to protect public safety and are consistent with the broader principle that particularly dangerous weapons can be regulated more heavily. However, the judge concluded that the government's argument did not fully satisfy the historical test required under the Bruin ruling. The court noted that while some historical regulations existed regarding weapons, prosecutors did not provide strong evidence showing that early American governments imposed broad bans on entire categories of firearms in the same way modern machine gun laws do. Because the Bruin framework requires a clear historical analogy, the absence of comparable founding-era restrictions weakened the government's case. Based on that reasoning, the judge determined that the prosecution had failed to demonstrate that the modern federal prohibition aligns with the historical understanding of the Second Amendment. As a result, the court ruled that the machine gun possession charges could not proceed in this particular case, leading to the dismissal of the charges against the defendant. After the court dismissed the machine gun possession charges, the decision quickly drew a response from the United States Department of Justice, which strongly disagreed with the ruling. Federal prosecutors argued that the court's interpretation of the Second Amendment was flawed and warned that the decision could undermine long-standing federal firearm regulations if left unchallenged. Because machine guns are among the most heavily restricted weapons in the United States, the Justice Department views the law banning most civilian possession as an important public safety measure that has been consistently upheld by courts for decades. In its response, the Justice Department emphasized that federal law has historically allowed the government to regulate what courts often describe as dangerous and unusual weapons. According to prosecutors, machine guns fall clearly within that category because they are capable of firing multiple rounds with a single pull of the trigger and were designed primarily for military use. Officials argue that this distinction has long been recognized by courts and provides a strong legal basis for stricter regulation compared with ordinary firearms. The Justice Department also pointed to the fact that the federal restriction on machine guns stems from legislation passed by Congress under the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, which included the provision banning civilian possession of newly manufactured machine guns. Prosecutors maintain that this law has been enforced nationwide for decades and has survived numerous legal challenges in federal courts. From their perspective, the recent ruling conflicts with established precedent and could create legal uncertainty if similar arguments begin to succeed in other cases. Because of these concerns, the Justice Department is expected to challenge the decision through the appeals process. By appealing to a higher federal court, prosecutors hope to overturn the ruling and reaffirm the legality of the federal machine gun ban. Legal experts say the outcome of any appeal could play a crucial role in determining how lower courts interpret modern gun regulations in the future. Although the court's ruling only applies directly to the individual case in which the charges were dismissed, many legal experts believe the decision could have broader implications for firearm laws across the United States. The reasoning used by the judge reflects a growing trend in the federal court system after the landmark ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, where the Supreme Court of the United States established a new constitutional test for evaluating gun regulations. Under this approach, courts must determine whether modern firearm laws are consistent with the historical tradition of gun regulation from the time when the Second Amendment was adopted. Because of this requirement, many existing gun laws are now being challenged in federal courts. Gun rights advocates argue that if the government cannot show clear historical examples of similar restrictions from the late 18th or early 19th centuries, those modern regulations may violate the Second Amendment. As a result, lawsuits have been filed challenging a variety of firearm policies, including bans on certain types of weapons, limits on magazine capacity, and restrictions on how firearms can be carried in public. The recent decision involving machine gun possession has attracted particular attention because it questions a federal law that has been in place for decades. The restriction was created under the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986 and has long been considered one of the strongest firearm regulations in the country. If other courts begin to adopt similar reasoning, it could encourage more legal challenges aimed at weakening or overturning long-standing gun control measures. However, the ultimate impact of the ruling remains uncertain. Higher courts may still reverse the decision during the appeals process, which could reaffirm the legality of the federal machine gun ban. Until those appeals are resolved, the case serves as an example of how the Bruin decision continues to reshape the legal debate over gun rights and government regulation in the United States. For now, this case highlights a growing legal battle over how the Second Amendment should be interpreted in the modern era. And with the Department of Justice preparing to fight the decision, the final outcome could still be months or even years away. But one thing is clear: the debate over gun laws in America is far from settled.